A lot of you have been asking me on Discord, Twitter, YouTube comment sections, Facebook, your mom over dinner. Everyone's asked me about how I feel about these tank changes. And in this video, I'm going to try to express my thoughts. It's unscripted. I've tried recording this video like 10 times. I just want to share my thoughts. I feel like I'm beating a dead horse because every content creator and their mother has already talked about these changes and how they feel. There's a lot of negative perception in the community, but I'm going to try to play a devil's advocate role. And honestly, the reason why I haven't published a video about this yet is because I really wanted to not only digest the game philosophy shift that Blizzard is trying to implement here among, tanking, but I also wanted to take time to test it for myself, and I wanted to see what other kind of tuning Blizzard was going to try to implement to shape around this new philosophy shift. So if you're not aware, tanks received a pretty massive nerf recently, and when I say massive, I mean almost game-changing. Actually, beyond game-changing. We're seeing constant nerfs to active mitigation, as well as, defensive abilities. We're seeing a massive nerf to self-sustained and healing throughput. And all of these accompanied together make it so tanks need and depend on a healer. They depend on your group. And I'm going to talk about kind of that stuff in a second. Now, don't get me wrong, like base mitigation has been increased across the board for the most part. So like stagger effectiveness has been increased. Basic armor value, I would say, has been generally increased. So tanks feel sturdier against like base damage. So things like auto attacks. But you're going to be taking more sustained damage over time, and you have less abilities or less throughput per second to be able to top yourself without depending on a healer, depending on externals, depending on kiting. So that's kind of the shift that Blizzard is going for here. But let's first talk about why I guess I was pretty unhappy and why I didn't post immediately about this. I've been tanking for the last 5 years or so. I've been tanking Mythic Plus. I've tanked at the cutting edge level. In terms of rating, I've tanked at the, I guess I currently do still. I've tanked the cutting edge title pushing keys. I've tanked also on the other half. I've been tanking pretty casually lately, but basically I've been around the block. Tanking is one of my favorite roles. It's the reason I have this YouTube channel. I enjoy the complications beyond the class itself. I enjoy positioning mobs, figuring out how to optimize my group's efforts by, making sure mobs are positioned in the right way, making sure frontals aren't facing the group, making sure I'm doing whatever I can in terms of like externals or positioning that I can do to benefit the group. For Mythic Plus is something I'm a little bit more, I guess, known for is I enjoy routing. I think it's fun. So this role means a lot to me. And when I first read this news back on Wednesday or whenever this came out, Thursday, I was kind of shook and I was taken aback because I felt like Blizzard was destroying tanking, the philosophy of it that they've built up over the last couple of years. And I started tanking in Battle for Azeroth. I tanked casually back in Legion on like Protection Paladin, but like I would never consider myself a Paladin main or like a tank main back then. I was a DPS and a healer main. But ever since I've started tanking, I felt like tanks have always been in a position where if you're good enough at your class, you can live. And you can live for a long time and you can live a lot of things. And that type of power was always extremely attractive to me as a player, and I'm sure a lot of tanks might feel the same way. You obviously have the other end where, while tanks can't really do DPS level of damage, tanks definitely try to push themselves. And so a couple weeks ago, Blizzard had made an announcement that they were nerfing trinket damage for tanks, which is where a lot of our tank damage comes from. So trinkets from like Dragonflight, think of Mana Grief Torch, think of Storm Eater's Boon, think of Beacon to Beyond. These types of trinkets were what allow tanks to like really push their damage to be competitive. And while quote unquote parsing will always exist, and not that I'm necessarily a parse whore, parsing is a fun part of the game, and trying to push your damage to the absolute maximum is always fun, especially because you can start beating some of your DPS on your raid team or in pugs. They're taking that away. And so I was kind of down in the dumps on that because that just felt like it's like, okay, well, now we're just going to take tank trinkets because they're just, the main stat is fine. And now they're saying, well, we're going to nerf your healing. Oh, and we're going to nerf your ability to sustain yourself. We're nerfing your cooldowns and your throughput. So we're taking like the three things that tanks could try to push. And now, this is before I kind of did testing, I felt like they were pushing us just to be meat puppets. We're going in there, we're getting hit in the face, and our DPS have to kill the things for us, and our healers are going to keep us alive. And what sucks the most about this, and no flame to healer players, but Blizzard's been really struggling at figuring out an identity and a cadence for healers for the last, 4 years? Since I would say like early Shadowlands. And even then, like, you had things like Ashen Hollow, which I don't know really rectify anything. But healing's been in a weird spot. And I feel like Blizzard still hasn't figured out necessarily where they want healers to be. Or maybe they know, but the approach that they're taking is like really strange, right? Because instead of fixing healers or the damage profile of a key, they're instead saying tanks are not going to be able to live, so you have to heal them. Which sucks for a portion of the audience, because there are healers out there who do like to do damage and like to plan their cooldowns with basically damage profiles of keys, where it's like, okay, for these 15 seconds, there's not going to be any damage going out, so I can do damage during this time. Where now, if you're a healer, you're going to find yourself committing a lot more globals to healing than you would be to trying to figure out when can I damage, when can I heal. And I don't know if this is necessarily the fix. I don't know how healers feel about this. Like, do they really just want to sit there and heal? Or do healers tend to like kind of the ebb and flow of combat, where it's like, okay, spike of damage here. Okay, now I get to relax for 10, 15 seconds and do some damage. Or I get to maybe focus on getting some CC out. Maybe I can focus on like pulling back and trying to get some mana. So I feel like in terms of, in trying to fix one in terms of Blizzard trying to fix a role, they're hurting another one. That's generally why I was upset when they made this announcement last week. But after, I took some time, I played some Minecraft, I hung out. I then was able to jump on to beta because I wanted to do some testing for myself. And I was hoping to see some tuning adjustments following these announcements. And while we got some, I'm a little concerned because we're about a month out from the expansion launching. And unfortunately, tanking is not looking super great. But let's talk about my testing really quick, because I think it's important to note this, is that testing actually felt fine. I was a little concerned going in. Some tanks feel worse than others, I will admit. Brewmaster feels like an absolute unit for anyone who's been playing Brewmaster. Brewmaster Monk got some insane buffs. Some like quick examples is that the Monk's armor was increased from a passive called Brewmaster's Balance. We're also just doing a flat 8% more stagger, which is great. They finally increased the magic damage that we staggered from like 45% all the way up to 58%. And while some of our healing was reduced, like Yu'lon's Grace, Celestial Fortune, and Celestial Brew, generally speaking, the increase in stagger, as well as the strength of Celestial Fortune still, results in feeling somewhat immortal, and I guess it is probably one of the best tanks to currently heal in Mythic Plus. I haven't done any raid testing personally on beta, and I don't know if there even was any since they've made these announcements. But essentially what they've done is they've reduced our ability to dodge, but they've increased our armor, and they increased the amount we stagger, which feels very, very good. An kind of like an unintended consequence of this, or I guess like that works in benefit for the Brewmaster Monk specifically, is that Guy Plin's Imperial Brew now actually slaps. But it is very weird seeing things like Healing Sphere and things like Celestial Brew being a little bit lower on our overall healing. Some other tanks didn't get so lucky with this kind of stuff. Vengeance DH kind of got some pretty significant nerfs, I would say. Their stamina's actually been reduced. Things like Live by the Glaive has been nerfed as well. Their parry chance has been reduced. The amount of frailty and like what frailty heals you for has been reduced a little bit. And they definitely got some nerfs to their, I guess I would say talents, things like Dark Glare Boon and Down in Flames. So they're going to have less uptime on things like Meta. They're going to have less uptime on things like Fiery Brand. And generally speaking, their parry chance is going to be like lower, which is like the main way they mitigate outside of obviously healing and reducing damage through some kind of tertiary effects via like Demon Muzzle. But essentially what I'm trying to get at is that for the most part, most tanks have had an increase to what they can passively reduce from melee attacks. Another big shift, though, that we are seeing kind of across the board for the most part, I'd say, is that a lot of these cooldowns have been reduced as well. As I just talked about, meta has been reduced in terms of duration, or as well, I shouldn't say duration, I should say stamina. But Protection Paladin is seeing a Sentinel uptime reduction by about 20%. Eye of Tears being nerfed by about 33%, and your cooldown recovery is being changed as well. Warrior had a reduction in armor, but they actually increased the uptime on shield wall. But basically across the board, the way that the thing that Blizzard wants to do the most is make tanks take more damage over time, but less spiky damage. Well, there actually tended to be like a slight imbalance on how much damage every tank was mitigating. Things like Protection Warrior, Protection Paladin, Guardian Druid were mitigating a ton of damage via just armor. So the armor reduction is actually to pull some things in line. And what ends up happening is that slightly more damage is actually going to end up coming through over the course of a pull, which means that healing from a healer is going to be more effective. And it's now a fourth person that the healer needs to now be paying attention to. After reading all the nerfs and the changes that they were making to these tanks, I was a little taken aback. I was just like, these are massive. We're 4 weeks out from the expansion, and this is nuts. So anyways, I jumped on beta, and I wanted to just jump into a few keys. I did some keys like Mist of Tyrannus Scythe and Stone Vault to get a grasp on how the tanks were feeling, I guess, in terms of the damage they were taking. My Brewmaster felt phenomenal. I was mitigating a ton of damage up front. I had big cooldowns when I needed to through high stacks of Purified Chi, along with like a nice 5 stack of Gift of the Ox. Celestial Fortune, also insanely strong still. I know that the nerf, wasn't sizable. It went from 80% of crit to 70%, but now it's still insanely potent, especially when you're pairing it with like a Resto Druid or something like that. But Prot Warrior, I've done a couple keys on Prot Warrior since these changes, and some dungeons I feel great on. Some dungeons, not so much. When you have a healer who doesn't actually heal you, you tend to fall over very quickly, regardless of your shield block uptime or your defensive usage, which definitely created this like bittersweet feeling. So tanking feeling a little bit more, sketchy is, I guess, the word. Like, the fact that all tanks are now taking damage is interesting, and I think healers need to now get used to that. And I think tanks do too. But the problem that I'm having is that I was extremely frustrated because I'm not going to name names. Also, it doesn't matter because it's beta testing and this person might not even be using their real name, but I ran a key with a Mistweaver who like just straight up wasn't healing me, and it felt so bad. And benefit of the doubt, he said he didn't know the dungeon all that well, and on top of that, the dungeon has changed pretty significantly, and arguably we're scaled down fairly low, but even in this Mist of Tyrannus Scythe, a notably easier dungeon out of the bunch, I was still falling over on Prot Warrior. And Prot Warrior is a tank that, while I don't play it at the high end, I play it very frequently, and I have pushed on it before. And I would say that it's a tank that hasn't really changed over the last couple of years, and it plays fairly similarly to how it always has. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that like I'm confident in my ability to play Prot Warrior, and it felt bad. It felt bad not being able to top myself or stop damage in such a way where I could actually stay alive. Praying and screaming into my mic, healer, heal me. And that's like my biggest problem with this change, is that the lack of tank agency is what really gets me. Impending Victory not really topping you off, Indomitable not having the same gusto as it has, and having an increase in total stamina means that even if a healer is pushing heals into you, it's going to take a few seconds to get you topped. And while you can stop damage and have, instances where you're able to halt your incoming damage for a little bit through cooldowns or through kiting, I don't want to be doing this forever, which kind of leads me to like my last concern. And I wasn't doing high enough keys in, this last weekend to be able to actually test when you need to start doing this, but there were a lot of instances where it would have just been better for me to kite. And kiting meta, from a tank's perspective, is the worst thing. Because it's not fun to use your global. The global that you're using is holding W to run away. That is such a horrible feeling. And it feels bad for DPS players as well, because typically DPS players will also lose throughput when the tank is running in circles or running around or like running down the hallway away from mobs. And that's probably like the worst feeling, is that once you get to a high enough key, your healer really has to push heals into you or you have to kite. And there's no more of this, I can muscle through it, because tanks generally have less time on their major mitigation and their self-sustain is much lower. So I was hopeful when Blizzard announced this, and then shortly after they actually announced a nerf to Fortified, the Fortified affix in itself. But we haven't seen many changes outside of that. We haven't seen a lot of tuning to the dungeons or mob mechanics specifically. So there's instances where there's certain mobs in these dungeons that just delete groups. Not even just tanks. I mean like delete groups. And now that we're adding a fourth person for the healer to have to heal and pay attention to, it's gonna take some getting used to. Blizzard notoriously, even throughout Dragonflight, while they have been getting better at it, in my opinion, they're still a very long way away from tuning dungeons properly. There were things in Season 4 of Dragonflight, because we saw the dungeons that we've seen in Season 1 and Season 2. There were still things in Season 4 that have yet to be fixed from Season 1 and Season 2, let alone beta testing from Dragonflight, which is 2 years ago now. Am I hopeful for these changes? Not really. I'd like to be, but I've yet to see tuning on Blizzard's end, and that's really what this is coming down to. If Blizzard tunes dungeon mobs right, they tune tank busters properly. Oh, that's another thing. It's so hard to play on beta without like weak ores and dungeon timers, but I digress. Blizzard needs to tune things properly. Fortified change was fine, but they need to now start looking at certain mechanics in dungeons. It's not fun having to pull a pack at a time. It's not fun having to kite every 20 seconds after you pull a pack, because now you're out of defensive and you're out of mitigation. Benefit of the doubt is during testing, we are scaled down to 580 item level, which for those who don't know is less than Raid Finder gear. We are basically in like, I would say, I don't know, normal dungeon gear or heroic dungeon gear, or like a little bit lower than heroic dungeon gear. We're very low. So we're missing out on secondary stats, and we're missing out on primary stat. Two very important things for a lot of tanks. Main stat allows you to mitigate more and do more damage. Secondary stats generally will change the cadence of your gameplay, allowing you to have higher uptime on your mitigation. So all in all, sorry this video took so long to make and to get out, because I really needed to sit on this for a bit and think about how I feel about this. Are these changes good? I'm like trying to think of a good conclusion here, guys. I'm trying to give you a little bit of hope. I'm not thrilled with these tank changes, and it's going to take time to get used to. I will be happy with them, I think, if Blizzard can nail the tuning of the dungeons. But if I'm now running Mythic Plus, praying that my healer and my DPS keep me alive, I'm not going to be very happy. So we'll see over the next couple of weeks. Keep an eye out for those dungeon changes. We want to see some nerfs to a lot of abilities, like a lot of abilities. And yeah, we'll go from there. Anyways, I appreciate you guys taking the time to listen to me rant about this. Let me know what you think about this video format. It was a little different. Unscripted 1, 2. I'm not really using a lot of B-roll footage. I wanted to try this little waveform thing. More like a podcast, I guess, style video. But anyways, without rambling too much, big shout out to all my Patreon supporters. Without you guys, there would literally be no content like this. So thank you. I hope you're all staying happy, healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Peace.